Thank you all for coming. This session, just in case you know, it's like on the airlines where they're like, you know, we're going to Washington, D.C. If you don't want to go to Washington, you should not get off the plane. You should get off the plane now. This is all about investing in media startups. We've got a great group of people here who have been doing that for a long time. I'm the moderator. I'm Jim Louderback. I ran a couple of startups and sold them to media companies, and in between the two, worked as a venture partner at a seed fund, so seen both sides of it. But I'll mostly be asking these guys questions and trying to keep my opinions out of it. We'll see how that goes. It never works. I want to introduce the panelists, and I'm going to give each of them an opportunity to talk a little bit about what they're doing, and then we'll jump into questions. I also want to make sure for all of you, if you have questions, you want to ask a question, get involved in the conversation, this is your conference, this is your session. Put your hand up. The folks running the mics know that we're going to be taking questions all the way through. So feel free to do that. Don't be upset if I cut you off, because sometimes people ask questions where they're really just trying to just pitch their product or something like that. So we'll just have some fun with it, see where it goes, and we're going to stop right on time, 50 minutes. So we'll be stopping 10 minutes till 1800. So anyway, to my immediate left is Bilal Randeree. He's the director of MDIF Africa. Next to him, Sim Blaustein, partner at Bertelsmann Digital Media Investments. And finally, all the way down there at the far corner is Deepa Iyer, who is an associate in investments at Luminate. So, Bilal, let's start with you. Talk a little bit about what you do.
Okay, so is this thing on? Can you guys hear me? My voice isn't as loud as this guy's. So MDIF is the Media Development Investment Fund. I know it's a mouthful. It used to be called MDLF, the Media Development Loan Fund. So started in around 95, 96 as a bank for media companies. I joined just about 2 years ago as the Africa director, and since the beginning of the year also dealing with, I don't know whether to call it MENA or Arab world, or but expanded north of Africa into Arab-speaking companies as well. And what we do is we invest in media companies. I mean, the website will have the full list of criteria, but I would summarize it as independent media companies that are doing good journalism. And the important thing is we invest. So whether we're doing a debt or equity investment, it's not grant, it's not free money. There has to be a solid business case. There has to be the ability for us to put money into an entity and get more than what we put in out, so that we can continue supporting other businesses. Through the last 20 some odd years, we've worked with over 100 companies in 40 countries, and the fund size is about 120 million. So relatively small compared to some of the other big players, but we focus really on independent quality journalism, and especially now in 2019, it's quite a challenging thing being in the space. So yeah. Yeah,
we'll get into it. Totally. Sim, give us a background.
Sure. So Sim Blaustein, I'm a partner at BDMI, which is Bertelsmann Digital Media Investments. I guess we have a lot of acronyms going this way. Bertelsmann is a big media company based in Germany. Most of the time, Europeans sort of nod their heads like you are. A lot of times Americans have to explain what we do. But Bertelsmann is the parent company of the RTL Group, which is a very large broadcaster in Europe, Fremantle, which is a global television production company, Penguin Random House, for those who read books, Gruner & Jahr in the magazine sector, BMG in music, Arvato in the consulting services side, and actually we also have a new division focused on for-profit education, imaginatively called Bertelsmann Education Group. As a venture fund, we have both a financial and a strategic mandate. So we're investing out of a $150 million early stage venture capital fund. The whole team is based in New York. I'm one of the 3 partners. And we typically do Series A investments, $1 to $5 million. We operate much like any other traditional venture capital fund, with the exception that we look for investments where we have a competitive advantage. So that could mean a consumer-facing media company. It could mean a technology company that works with media companies. It could mean a product company that has a particular angle in content as well. And our mandate is, as I said, financial return, but we do spend a lot of time helping connect companies from the startup and technology ecosystem back to our parent company, which is over 185 years old.
Yep. Nice. Deepa?
Hi, I'm Deepa Iyer. I work at Luminate. We were formerly called a Midyar network. So we are part of the family office of Pierre Midyar, who is one of the founders of eBay. We spun out into an independent fund late last year. I'll say a little bit more about our investment mandate. Last year, Pierre made a $100 million commitment to issues concerning media and misinformation because he was very concerned about the state of media, particularly in emerging markets, as sort of a key layer for citizens to be informed about their democratic systems. The media team at Luminate focuses on 4 different areas. One, we do for-profit equity investments into early-stage media companies globally, across the world. Secondly, we also do nonprofit grant-making to a range of high-quality investigative journalism that's holding power to account in different ways. We also are looking at third, different ways to build the media ecosystem. So we are an LP actually in the Media Development Investment Fund, and we are looking at a range of innovative financing mechanisms to build more liquidity in media markets. And last but not least, we actually do a lot of work around storytelling and specifically have the mandate to fund films, funds related to films. So we recently, for example, started a fund at the Sundance Film Festival to fund filmmakers from emerging markets. And so have, a range of different investment instruments we use and a range of different focus areas that we have. So.
Nice. So let's start out with you, Deepa. I want to start out and actually with all of you folks, and we'll get through it, but what's the latest media investment that you were a part of, and why? Why did you invest in that company, and what made it interesting?
Definitely. I'm going to use investment in a broader term because the latest media investment I was part of was actually a grant to an organization that's here, the Media Legal Defense Initiative. They actually work very closely globally with a range of different journalists and media outlets to get legal aid in instances of, duress or threat from either a government or in a defamation case. And the reason we invested in them was because even for our for-profit portfolio, we were just seeing, particularly for companies and nonprofits, whether it's Rappler in the Philippines, or which is in our portfolio, or The Wire in India, which is not in our portfolio, or Scroll, which is in our portfolio. They were just racking up so many defamation cases that it's really a distraction, I think, for a lot of these companies at an early stage. And so we're thinking, okay, let's use some of our grant capital to sort of build an ecosystem around legal aid and see how we can do that.
Cool. So it was more of a nonprofit investment or an NGO?
Yes,
yep.
Yes, exactly.
And what are you looking at? What are some of the characteristics you're looking at from that organization as it grows with the capital that it gave you?
I think on the nonprofit side, it's interesting because we often see a lot of nonprofits that just have really restricted money from different foundations. And so we're looking at, hey, how can we unlock core growth for them and let them really, leverage our capital in an unconditional way to build out their team, build out their operations. And so for us, I think it was more about, hey, what is critical to your organizational health, because I think other funders have not focused on that. They've funded you in a way that's been very restricted to a specific region or to a specific, funder-driven mandate. And so for us, I think when we fund nonprofits, we're very aware of that and kind of focus more on what they need to sort of thrive overall sustainably.
Cool. Bilal, how about you? What was the last media investment you were part of, and why?
So over the last year and a half, we've been working on it's called the South Africa, we have lost the acronyms. It's called the South Africa Media Innovation Program, SAMUP, S-A-M-I-P. And it's partly funded by Luminate and Open Society Foundation of South Africa. And SAMUP is very different from what MDIF usually does. It's because we've taken this money that would otherwise be distributed as pure grants as part of media programs. And we're saying, okay, there's this gap that exists. If you look at one end of the spectrum, you have media organizations being able to access grant funding from various different organizations. And some of them do so for many years, but not all are able to reach a level of maturity where they meet the criteria and have a low enough risk profile for MDIF or any other serious investor to consider. So the SAMUP program is trying to experiment in the space in between and say, okay, by MDIF following our methodology, so to say, that's slightly different from the way grant giving bodies operate. Can we make that gap smaller, using this as bridge financing? But for the South Africa program, we've got the added objective of transformation, which in the South African context is saying media in the country is very old and white, so you have old white men running media companies. Let's use this money to focus and prioritize females, people of color, and young people under the age of 35. So these are people that are either running these companies, owning these companies, and so we prioritize support for them. And it's a year and a half into a 4-year program. We've got 12 companies, organizations in the program. We have soon to add 3 more. And we're beginning now to start the equity investment. The first initial part of the program was identifying what the needs are, providing small technical grants, technical assistance, helping them through those initial stages. And for those that are now beginning to show signs of success, while they may not be ready at the stage that MDIF would consider making investments, we're able to, in this program, reduce or rather lower the risk profile or have a high appetite for risk and start making equity investments that we can treat. So, introduce the same levels of governance, the same financial discipline that you would need, that often getting and I mean this with respect, getting the cheap grant money tends to make sometimes organizations lazy, or it tends to distract them from what they're actually good at, but they're chasing money that's there for specific reasons. So, it's a number of different things we're trying to achieve, but it's been embraced, very positively with Open Society, Luminate, and there's a lot of interest now in this to say, okay, how do we expand this program to now in East Africa, in Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, in these countries, we're finding a similar thing. There's a lack of strong independent media, and so can this model be modified to be rolled out there? In North Africa, Middle East, the same. So.
What's the criteria that you use then for someone to come into the SAMIT? So how do you decide who gets in and who doesn't?
So SAMUP decisions were made by, there's an independent, well, not so independent, there's a advisory committee which represents the 3 parties, so MDIF, Luminate, and OSF, and 3 independent members, and they make decisions on who's entered into the program or not. And we've structured it to focus on 6 focus areas. So in the South African context, again, that's looking at media that are operating outside the main urban areas. Mm-hmm. Everything tends to be concentrated in Johannesburg, Cape Town, in Durban. So what are you doing in the rural areas? Second is language. South Africa has 11 official languages, yet all media is either in English and Afrikaans. So we've prioritized any media that's working in languages other than this. Third is then looking at legacy media, so transitioning traditional transitioning traditional media to digital, supporting those specifically. And then we look at the innovation side. So who's being innovative around opening up new revenue streams, and what does that look like? Who's using technology in creative ways for distribution? And so, there's 12 companies. As I said, there's going to be 3 more. The details are all on the website. Definitely, please look them up. Some of the highlights. So one of these that we incubated or entered into the program was rather incubated by Snapchat's Yellow incubator. So, they got a 150 investment, and they got to spend 3 months at Snap's incubator in LA. And which company was that? So it's called #OurStories.
#OurStories, yeah.
Yeah,
right.
And they got fans in the audience from what my Twitter says, so yeah.
Cool. Sim, talk about the last media investment you were part of and why you did it.
Sure. Can I give 2 answers?
Yeah, you can give 2 answers.
All right, I like it. So the most recent media investment we did was actually a B2B software company called Storyfit, which uses artificial intelligence to analyze scripts for TV shows and movies. And they actually are starting to work on books as well. And they actually help create less obvious insights either for improving the scripts for the creation of content. So if you want to actually use data to improve the writing on your television show or in your movie, and also after the movie is made, helping marketers actually understand what kinds of audiences are most likely to resonate with that film based on things in the scripts. And it could be, you know, traditionally things are done using fairly obvious things like what's the genre, is it horror, is it action, or who are the actors that are starring in it, or what's the director. But they're actually finding really interesting patterns around everything from the amount of dialogue. For example, they might make a suggestion that says there's way too much exposition, there's way too much talking by one character, or this movie or this show has too many characters. Think about trimming it down, because we found that, you know, fewer characters that have more depth can be more successful. And we're starting to really get excited, to answer your second question proactively. We're starting to get really excited about applications of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the creative fields. So as an investment fund, we're not particularly technical. We're not going to be analyzing the algorithms and trying to figure out whether or not their AI is smarter than the other AI. But we do think that there's a point at which we're now at where you can actually leverage some of the insights that these algorithms have to improve the quality and efficiency of creativity. The second company, just because I like talking, it was my deal and I like talking about it, is called Scroll. Which is from Tony Hale, who is the CEO of Chartbeat. And what Scroll is going to be launching is a $5 a month subscription that gives its users ad-free access to a network of top-tier publishers. And so their goal is to look at things like the ad blocker, we call it an ad blocking problem in the media industry, as a consumer signal that says, we like your content, but we don't want to see as many ads. And we're big fans of paywalls. We think there's going to be a lot of very successful publishers that put their content behind a paywall. But at the same time, there are a lot of users that will not read enough of that publisher's content frequently enough to merit paying $5 or $10 a month. But at the same time, we think there's an opportunity to actually create a better user experience using technology that Tony and his team have developed that actually allows the publisher to recognize you across both social networks as well as web browsing, and provide a consistent experience that not only doesn't show you ads, but also allows you to pick up an article where you left off on one device if you want to read it later, or see what your friends are reading, or capture things like that. So we're super excited about that. He should be launching later this year, and is in beta with a few publishers.
Go ahead.
So just very quickly, full disclosure. So Tony used to be on the MDIF board. Like I've been a big fan of his because he was behind Chartbeat. I don't know if anyone has worked in the newsroom.
How many people use Chartbeat or know what Chartbeat is? A couple of you. It actually real-time gives you analytics on what's going on your website, who's reading it, how many people are there. You guys can probably talk about it better than me.
I'm just going to say, like, I remember
2010,
2011 at Al Jazeera we had a screen up with Chartbeat in the newsroom when we were doing the Arab Spring coverage, and it was, really exciting. It's
a great tool. Let's talk about things that you might passed on, or something maybe you passed on and wished you hadn't. Who wants to pick that one up first? Anything you passed on you wished you hadn't, and you're like, oh, darn, I could have gotten into that.
I mean, we passed on Gimlet and Pluto, both of which were very big exits in the last couple of months.
Yeah, Pluto did all right, huh?
Yeah.
I sold my last company to the company that bought Pluto, so yeah. Anything else that you guys want to talk about, something you passed on and you're like, oh, damn, why'd I do that?
I feel like there hasn't been anything yet that I've been like, oh, damn, but there have been a few things that I was like, oh.
Closer to the mic.
I said there have been mostly things that I felt like justified I passed on as opposed
Well, we'll get to that. So, okay, let's move into that one. So tell me one that you feel like you passed on, you were justified, and talk about what that means for the state of media investing.
Yeah, I think, generally when I pass on opportunities, I feel like I really look very closely at the team and whether they're focusing purely on content initially or whether they're thinking about organizational sustainability in like a more, in a slightly deeper way. Because I think often when you see journalists that are founding companies, it's very easy to start focused on content, but not necessarily perhaps like plan from day one a little bit further ahead. And so I think for me, generally when I've passed on opportunities, it's because I've been unable to see that sort of dual mindset very early on. And that has yielded, a company falling into dire straits in within a month or two, generally quite quickly. So yeah.
Yeah. So that'd be one key, I think, tip from you is that if you want to raise money as a media company, as a journalism-driven company, you need to look at more than just creating the content. You got to think about the business model in that as well.
Exactly.
Is that right?
Yes,
yeah.
exactly.
You guys?
So I haven't had opportunity to pass.
Right, you're still bringing people in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But also, mostly when we describe, at least when I describe what it is that MDIF does, the response, especially from people who are not in the media, is one of shock. It's like what are you guys even trying to do? This is 2019. We look around us and newspapers are collapsing, and media is in a sad place generally. I think we've got enough success under our belt, and there's enough excitement, there's enough that exists globally in the space that excites us, me and my colleagues, to say that yes, while things are difficult to some extent, there's still a lot of opportunity and there's still a lot of demand for quality work, yep. and that's quite refreshing. And so a good example is in December 2017, we bought or took over the Mail and Guardian, which is for anyone who's been to South Africa or knows South Africa, it's a very important newspaper that had been running at a loss for 2 or 3 years. And just now, in 2018, now the Mail and Guardian was profitable again. And you go into the newsroom and there's a renewed energy and excitement. And honestly, we didn't really do, I don't want to say we didn't do much, but we showed up, and I think that was partly the most important thing about winning the battle. Because what happens, and using the Mail and Guardian as maybe a case study, is so fine. A couple of years ago, they had made some bad business decisions, and this is always something which I think happens more often than it should, because you have very strong editorial people making non-editorial decisions without consulting enough, or anyways. So the Mail and Guardian made some bad decisions, and that caused some cash flow problems. And so it becomes a downward spiral. You're late on paying your salaries 1 month. Your rockstar journalists decide, things are not good here, let's take a better offer somewhere else. That affects morale across the news organization, from the newsroom down. And then, people start showing up work, they're not giving it their best. And then literally all we do is we show up and we say, okay, we're the new owners, you get paid your salary on time, and you kick down a few doors, put up a few whiteboards, but literally overnight, everyone shows up with a renewed excitement and energy, and you just see things turning around. And so this is still a newspaper, in 2018, a newspaper that's profitable, that we haven't even begun to do the turnaround plan on digital yet, and unlock the potential revenues. We're busy working with them to launch a online membership plan and stuff. And so, I guess in summary, it's 2019, but newspapers can and are still doing well.
Well, so Sim, would you invest in a newspaper? Tell me about what you think. It's a facetious question, because I know you wouldn't, I don't think. But tell me about what's not fundable in the media world these days. What do you think from your perspective?
The list is so long.
Well, so just give me some examples. You just said you don't have to.
Sure.
Just a couple categories or examples or something like that.
Yeah. So I think there's been a general sort of downturn or lack of interest in ad-supported businesses in general. I do think that there's
Why? What's wrong with ad-supported businesses?
So I think there's a couple of things. One is there's nothing wrong with ad-supported businesses, but investors are excited about other areas more, right? So there was a
is that because they're
as you say, there was a video of sheep
running
in the background.
VCs tend to be sheep.
As investors love to sort of flock to the next big thing. So I think there was a VR panel in here just before us. 2 years ago, everybody would be talking about how excited they are about VR. Now nobody wants to touch it with a 10-foot
Same thing with blockchain and cryptocurrency, right? Same thing.
The minute the price of Bitcoin crashed, all of the VCs were like, "Oh, we were never invested in that." So I think that so the first answer is there are just things that go in and out of favor from a venture capital perspective, and ad-supported media is for sure out of favor.
What else?
The other reason is the sort of accepted wisdom that Google and Facebook and increasingly Amazon are sort of getting all the goods, right? They're getting the best of the best. They're the most profitable, and from both a traffic perspective, because it used to be very easy to get free traffic from Facebook, and that fire hose got turned off. And from a monetization perspective, it used to be relatively easy to sell advertising as an independent media company, and of course that got increasingly taken share. those more traditional, I'd say traditional in quotes, business models are definitely more challenged from an investment perspective.
What about, and I'll throw it out to everyone, then I'm going to open it up to questions from you guys, and then we'll go back and jump into some of the more sort of tips and tricks and getting noticed. What about, what else from your perspective is not fundable or that you're not looking at? I mean, it used to be people would invest in content, and then content got a bad rap, and people wouldn't do content businesses. I sense that's shifting a little bit because with membership and other things, people are coming back to that.
We passed on Gimlet for that very reason. So, and that's why there's always exceptions.
And Gimlet, who sold to Spotify for a metric ton of money.
Yeah, it was over, I think, $240 million. I mean, they were spending a lot of money creating very high quality podcasts, and we just felt like it looked very much like a traditional content studio, and it's very hard to, there's a sense that it's very hit driven and it's not pattern matching to venture capital models, but that turned out to be a very successful company.
So Deepa, what do you see out there for things? It doesn't necessarily have to be stuff that you would invest in, but you've been working in the investment world for a long time. What do you think out there on the media side that's just not fundable, hard to get money for, it's kind of a struggle?
I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, even in terms of how we've defined our own investment mandate, we will only invest in ad-based businesses in countries where that business is basically playing a very unique role in the ecosystem. So our investment in Rappler, that was the case. Our investment in Scroll in India, that's definitely the case. But for the most part now, we're looking at non-ad driven models, which, diversified revenues or subscription-based models for the most part. So a recent investment we did in India was in a business called The Ken, which is innovating both in terms of format and in terms of subscription journalism. So they send out one long-form piece of business content a day and then have very sort of active engagement with their group of readers. And they're profitable within a year. And I think admittedly they are working with an audience that has disposable income to pay, given it's business journalism. They're targeting largely like a business community, but I think it's still promising because it's rare to see a sort of company operating in that space, in that market, that's like profitable within such a short period of time. So we're generally looking for these like green shoots within this sort of very dark landscape in some sense.
The desert. Yeah. Bilal, how about from your side?
So I'm using this example, and it had been brought up earlier today, the Daily Maverick, which again, they're not that young, they're 10 years old now, but they just, about 6 months ago, they launched the Maverick Insider, so the membership plan. So it's not a paywall, it's a voluntary membership-based program. And it's doing very well. And that's because of the important role that the media played in South Africa in the last 2 or 3 years with state capture and President Jacob Zuma and the corruption that was going on, that was uncovered by investigative journalism, by a lot of collaboration between different newsrooms, Mail and Guardian, Daily Maverick, other journalists. And so the Daily Maverick is beginning to open, at least in the South African case, and we're not seeing it much elsewhere in Africa yet, for people, for the audiences, for society to recognize the value that independent journalism plays, and the benefit of having funding that's not tied down to big business interest or political interest and so on. And so again, like, does that make business sense, or is that I don't know, but from our lens, looking at the MDIF impact investing model, it's certainly very exciting. And 2019 is going to be the year where we pay attention to membership programs and how to and various ways of getting money from your audiences.
Yep. Questions from the audience for these guys? We've got a question right down here. Yep, right over here. Mike's coming. And then a question in the back, too. Awesome.
First, congratulations on fantastic moderation. Really glad you all properly introduced yourselves. I've been at lots of panels where we really have no idea what anybody actually does. I'm not pitching, but I write a lot about media startups in the global south, and you're talking about India, South Africa, which are pretty big markets comparatively. I'm curious to know, because I worry about this all the time from Luminate and MDIF, are there some markets that are so small it's actually bad to have a lot of startups? Do they start sort of competing with each other? Places where there's low income or not much advertising? How do you think about that?
Yeah, are there toxic markets, places where you wouldn't do it? Who wants to pick up on that?
I think there are markets that we invest in, like Myanmar, for example, where we are very careful with the way we structure the investment because we don't want our investment to skew the market in any way. And we're also very careful, obviously, about sort of who the operators are, the trust that we're placing in them, you know, the regulation in that market as a foreign investor. So I don't think it means we won't do it necessarily. For us, as you know, as a family office, we believe that we can take that risk. We are philanthropic capital, but it requires an extra level of scrutiny generally.
Cool. Yeah, Sim, we were talking about this earlier about Europe and how hard it is to invest in media startups in Europe because every market is different. You want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
into the mic.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Bertelsmann is a European-based company, and we're a media-focused investor, and a lot of people wonder why we don't have as many media-related investments in Europe. And what we found historically is that it's extremely difficult to scale, particularly in advertising-based, audience-based business in a market that's so fragmented. We see, you know, companies that are relatively successful building an audience in France, but there's no competitive advantage in expanding into Germany or into the Netherlands. You know, you see German companies that can speak to you know, half the Swiss audience and the Austrian audience, but they're not able to expand outside of the language. And at the same time, advertisers are generally not interested in reaching a pan-European audience. They're looking to reach, you know, they've got a budget for France and they've got a different budget for Belgium.
Yep, Deepa, jump in.
Yeah, I think I might also add actually that something that we've found in some markets that we're looking at, like Myanmar and Venezuela particularly, that a lot of the startups that you find there are so highly leveraged by the time you come in that it's really hard to sort of, you know, undo like almost the, you know, the pitfalls of really, really high interest rate debt. Yep. So, yeah.
Deepa, take a look at it from an Africa perspective, both for what you've done and sort of perspective you have in the region. Are there areas there that don't make sense where you just wouldn't do it, or how do you think about that?
So we, interestingly enough, late last year, did a deal with a radio station in Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries on the continent. And it's because of the unique way, I guess, that we, compared to other investors, measure ourselves. So one, yes, it is on the investment side, but two, it's on the impact. So this is a relatively, you know, small deal, but a radio station that's quite influential. Elections are coming up this year. And so for all these reasons, it makes a lot of sense for us to, you know, go in there and support what would otherwise, you know, be a very difficult business decision to justify. Going back to the question about startups, in fact, so apart from North Africa and the Middle East, without exception across sub-Saharan Africa, in places like Kenya, where there is a buzz and activity of startups, and you know the startup culture is quite strong. When it comes to media initiatives and media companies, there is a severe lack, and I mean, some of it could be you know, boiled down to political situations and what you're seeing. Maybe not necessarily in Kenya, but for sure in neighboring Tanzania and Uganda. You know, political suppression, and but even in South Africa, where you know access to funding would be relatively easy compared to the rest of the continent, it's just perhaps not the most sexy and you know the best opportunity. So you know the smartest young bright minds are finding other things to keep themselves busy with, which are, you know, fair enough, are also equally important from a, you know, social point of view.
Cool. We have another question in the back.
Thank you. I'm Pia, and I'm co-founder of a media startup, Opinory, and I'd be interested in what your non-obvious learnings are from the developments of other heavily funded media startups like Mike or BuzzFeed.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the more heavily funded media startups that may or may not be on their way out. I actually had a question here. I'm like, is there a Deadpool we should have? You guys want to riff a little bit on the media investments? There were tons of money were dumped in, and maybe they don't look so smart right now, or maybe they do.
I mean,
into the mic, Sam.
Sorry, this is a topic that I'm just going to lean forward. No, this is a topic that comes. I know, yeah. I didn't want to speak too loud. I have a pretty loud voice usually. This is a topic that comes up a lot in, you know, dinner and coffee conversations in New York amongst our community, and I actually think it's sort of important to separate the discussion of bad company versus bad investment. It's become very vogue to sort of, you know, talk about BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice as sort of, you know, failed companies or failed businesses. I think, in fact, they seem like fairly, you know, robust and successful companies that have just raised far too much money at far too high a valuation. Now, at the end of the day, they can turn out to be bad investments and maybe ultimately go out of business, which you know, which is potential. But I also think it overlooks the fact that they've actually accomplished quite a bit. So I don't know. This isn't really answering your question in particular, Pia, because you said non-obvious. But you know, I do think it's important to think about the sort of investment side. And of course, if you invested 100 million and the company sells for 20, that's not a good return for us. But I also think that, you know, even in the case of Mike, which we were investors in, you know, we didn't get a return on the business, but they're now part of Bustle, and they're actually thriving as a part of that business, and they continue to publish.
Anybody else want to add to that before we jump on? Doesn't sound. Go ahead. No.
So I mean, I don't know the exact details, but I know MDIF was also in Mike, and we actually did make a return on investment. I don't know why or how.
How?
I don't know.
We're waiting for our money.
But I think the more important part of that I want to agree with is this trend, and we're seeing it even. You know, with the little that we have in Africa or South Africa, that, you know, the ridiculously high valuations that get thrown at, and it just don't make sense. And I think that's a big problem, and something that maybe is not talked about enough in startup media circles.
Yep. So let's talk about if you have a startup idea and you want to get funding for it, and you want to talk to one of these folks here. How do you go about doing it? What are some ways, I guess, Sim, I'll start with you. How does a media startup position itself and package itself so that you guys actually will pay attention to it and even consider giving it money?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're an early stage investor, but we typically don't fund things at the idea stage. So number one, we're looking for some kind of product and market, and we're going to look at, you know, user engagement. For me, the most important thing to look at is are people actually using and loving your product in some way? I think in some cases there's an obvious business model, and so you don't have to explain that. But I think in some cases, you know, where it may be less obvious, you have to think about how the company will make money. And you know, the biggest area I think that is a challenge for entrepreneurs, not just in media but abroad, is to be able to tell the story and sort of paint the much bigger picture. So a lot of times we'll glom onto an idea where we realize that the thing that they're working on at the very current moment is a feature of a much broader potential business. And so the company that they're building isn't a very big opportunity, but it could actually be the start of something much bigger. And of course, the way to get us excited is to actually show that you have that vision and ambition to build something even bigger.
Yep. Deepa, how do startups, media companies that are looking for investment get your attention? What should they do? Give them some good tips.
I mean, for us, we do both.
Into the mic.
Sorry, for us, we
you
do
can pull
both,
it closer. You too.
We do both inbound and outbound sourcing. I mean, I will say personally, like, I just prioritize for the team the most and really like what their mission is, why they got started. I think in some of the markets that we are looking at, generally a lot of the startups that we're funding have a very specific like voice within their ecosystem in some sense. And so we're really looking at who the individual starting it is in order to sort of be that voice in some ways, and really like what their relationships are to get follow-on capital given a lack of liquidity in some of these markets. So,
well, it's interesting you talked about relationships, and I'll get to you in a sec. Hold on. But because I was going to go there, but you brought it up anyway. How important is it that someone knows somebody that knows one of you? Does that help?
That's not important for me at all.
Not important?
Say,
How about you?
100% important.
100% important. How about you?
Not that important.
Okay, so I'm going to take this question back to you and say, somebody wants to get into the accelerator. They're really interested in coming to you and saying, like, I got this great thing. What are the tips that they can do to make that a more interesting reason for you to A, take a meeting, and B, consider it?
So, as I said, in my experience, even coming across exciting stuff is so rare that anyone who's doing anything would catch my attention. So if you're operating anywhere in Africa or the Middle East, I want to talk to you, even if you're not ready for us. For me, I find it's important to know what's happening in the landscape, even if we can't add value directly. It's usually, because and I mean, this is, I don't think it's a uniquely African or Middle Eastern problem, is that, fine, you're a media startup and you're there to solve a problem, but the bigger problem is the ecosystem and the environment and the fact. So for example, in Tanzania, we just had a discussion last week where the person I was talking to said, you know, if all of us showed up and covered this cashew nut story, does anyone even know what the cashew nut story is? So this is huge. This is the potential of crippling the entire country's economy. The president showed up at a meeting between cashew farmers and buyers, and they were haggling on the price. They couldn't reach it. And it's like, no, 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 I'm going to buy the entire crop for the year, which the government did, somehow managed to find the money. But now that entire crop is sitting in storage, and unless there's a ticking time bomb, unless something's done with that pretty soon, the farmers might not be paid. It's going to have a ripple effect to the economy, and you know, cashew nut farming is a big part. But the problem is that no one of these individual media companies has the guts to, and see, one of them can't stand up and speak out because they'll be signaled out. But if everybody does something, then there's no way it can be hidden. And this is, I mean, maybe it's a too specific example to bring up, but as far as the environment that companies are operating in, I think this speaks to, you know, collaborating, working with each other. So in South African example, the Gupta Gates, you know, it was Amabungani, which is a big investigative unit, and many others who had to come together and put this together. But it seems like I'm getting sidetracked off the point of yes. So do whatever it is that you're doing and do it well. Do it well, yeah. There is the big problem of media companies and people who are strong editorially not knowing much or enough about the business side of things. So for example, in the South Africa program, like over the last 3 months, we've been running basic financial literacy courses, you know, teaching them, you need to be able to show up in front of investors, show projections, show budgets, show some sort of basic business plan. So not that you need to become like an accountant or finance person yourself, but you need to empower yourself with the basics so that you can instruct your accountant or your finance guy to put together the pieces that you need to be able to show any investor. Yeah, so it's not just have a good idea for building a media company, but also understanding the business side of it, of how you're going to get there. Let's flip the table and talk about what you shouldn't do. Oh, give me 1 second, because 1 second we'll get to questions, but what should you not do? And Deepa, I'll start with you. What shouldn't people do if they want to get your attention? What are some, or get your money? What shouldn't they do? I think generally, given we are a philanthropic capital, I'm very aware of the opportunity cost of our money. In some sense, like, if something is really well funded or really hot, like, it's not for us. You know, at the end of the day, like, it can get money elsewhere. So I shouldn't come with you a blockchain idea and expect to get money? Yeah, like, 2 years ago? I really prioritize like founders in markets that, you know, it's hard for them to raise capital. Like, they don't have the relationships to like find us necessarily. And like Bilal said, like, I'll take idea stage conversations and like try to push resources their way to like get them to that point. But I think, you know, given that we can take risk with our money, I think there is an onus to actually take that risk at the end. Cool. Sim and I were talking about this a little bit earlier. Give me an example of what you shouldn't do. Well, I do think that there's, you know, maybe not just in the media space, but we do often see companies, frankly, we're a financial investor. And so, you know, we like people who are passionate and ideological and stand for something. But at the same time, if a company is so mission driven that, for example, they might not be, you know, open to the, you know, most financially rewarding outcome, it's certainly something we'd have to consider. You know, I do feel like this isn't always tied to that example, but I feel like there's sometimes things feel more like passion projects than businesses. And because media attracts a lot of passion projects, you know, many times those are just businesses that should not raise venture capital. Yeah, so don't go to a venture capitalist and say, I'll never sell to that evil Google or that evil Facebook, because they're the ones that have some of the deepest pockets. Did we have a question out here somewhere? Yeah, go ahead, sir. Oh. I think she did. Oh, you had a question too? All right, we'll start here and then we'll go back there. Sorry.
You actually just started to touch on it, and thanks for a great panel. I was curious just about this nonprofit for-profit divide and the issue of nonprofit media, because a lot of funding for nonprofit media is also very closely tied to, of course, fulfilling that mission. At the same time, nonprofits often develop products that can be monetized and earn revenue. And I was just curious to hear your thoughts on coming in on some of those kinds of organizations or good examples you have of nonprofits that have also then generated revenue and then opened themselves up to other funding sources.
I'm happy to speak
Go ahead,
a little
Deepa.
bit to that. So, I mean, we do both. And I think generally, for all of our nonprofits, we're very cognizant that, you know, philanthropic funding is only sustainable for so long. You really have to diversify your revenue streams, figure out an earned revenue strategy if you're capable of doing that. I think we've also identified that for certain types of nonprofit investigative journalism, an earned revenue stream might not be viable. But I think for other ones, you know, there are certain... We're seeing actually in a lot of our nonprofit portfolio, they're developing technology tools that can be monetized in different ways if they actually like think about it smartly and are kind of, you know, thinking about innovative ways to like commercialize the tech that they're also building for their journalists to use. So I think, you know, for us, again, we focus on the entire health of the nonprofit organization that we fund. We fund them unconditionally, and we're also thinking with them constantly, how can you diversify plus like build out an earned revenue strategy of some sort. We also see in a lot of emerging markets hybrid models where, you know, a company will incorporate a nonprofit and a for-profit, and the for-profit is somehow, you know, focused on something adjacent but like near enough to media, but it's like somehow funding the nonprofit work basically in media. So you see a lot of different types of entities incorporated.
Sim, have you ever co-invested with a nonprofit?
Yeah, I mean, a number of the companies that we've invested in have raised money from like the Emerson Collective or Knight Foundation. Technically, I mean, I guess we're not really a nonprofit, but Bertelsmann's 3/4 of our business is owned by the Bertelsmann Foundation. So we're a majority nonprofit. We're a for-profit company that funds a foundation.
Anything real quickly? Stu doesn't want to get onto this question.
Sure. So, I mean, just taking up from Deepa's point, my bias is towards the hybrid model because especially in the region that I operate, there is a lot of grant funding available. But I think the trick is not to limit yourself either to that or just to, you know, to be totally on your own. It's to, you know, right now be able to navigate both and do so in a smart way so that you're always ahead of the curve.
Cool. Question over here.
So I have a question really for both Bilal and Deepa. And it's two questions, so I'll be quick. First, how do you assess political risk when you're making investment? How does that factor into your calculation, given that you work with a lot of authoritarian regimes, it seems? And the second question is about minority languages. And, you know, like, if you talk about Africa, for example, there are certain languages like French, English, Arabic, etc., that's big blocks. But there are also minority languages where the public sphere might be immature. Does that look like a risk or an opportunity for you?
Political risk. Let's start with that one first. Which one of you wants to take it first? Go ahead, Bilal.
Okay, so the easy way that we've, or at least I've been dealing with this, because I mean, you talk about political risk, I think it's the most amplified across the Arab world. And my preference has been looking at those companies that are operating in these areas, but from, you know, protecting themselves from a business point of view by how they're structured. So, you know, it could be a UK company, which is one of the pipeline companies we have operating across the region. And then the other interesting one is a podcast. So we're working to get a podcast company on board now that, because of the nature of how podcasts are distributed, it's going to be very difficult for that to be blocked in, you know, any specific market. And but there's been cases where, because of a website, for example, getting blocked in Egypt and Saudi, two of their biggest markets, it totally messes up the business model. And I mean, it's unfortunate because the team behind that for the last 3 or 4 years has been doing great work, but it just doesn't then meet our risk appetite, right, and we have to then make referrals to the likes of Luminate and others who can support.
Deepa?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we have made several risky investments in several risky markets. I think for us, political risk is something that we consider carefully and are learning by doing in some sense, given recent events with Rappler particularly. I think for us, you know, as Bilal mentioned, like looking very carefully at the incorporation structure and whether something has, you know, multiple entities, one in the market, one outside the market, that's something that you know, we start to look at quite a bit. But I think generally for us, we can take the risk, and so we're not going to say no necessarily, but I think we do look very closely at regulation and whether it's even makes sense, you know, in a specific context.
You know, real quickly, Sim, how do you think about risk? I know it's more on these other folks, but how do you think about that kind of political risk when you're doing investment?
I mean, we're focused primarily on North America and also do quite a bit in Israel and Europe. So for us, it could be more likely to be a regulatory risk, so things like GDPR and California privacy, which obviously have had impacts on many of our media and technology investments. It's definitely something that, you know, we have to be cognizant of. It also creates opportunities, and so we also like to think about the changing landscape and ways in which that can be leveraged to our portfolio's advantage.
Right, exactly. All right, let's move on to the next question, which was about minority languages. Well, you touched about this a little bit, but talk about that, and then, you know, Deepa, if you've got a perspective, and probably have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can respond specifically to what we're doing in South Africa. And, I mean, often, I mean, the reality is the main languages are well served because they're good business opportunity, and the minority language, so to say, aren't. But there is that middle space. So, for example, we're supporting a newspaper that's in isiZulu. And this is, it's actually, if you look at population of South Africa, isiZulu is the largest language, yet because of historic reasons and so on, it's been underserved. But they've got a print newspaper that's being distributed once a week. Next month, they're launching a Sunday paper. And again, you know, this is the type of thing where others in South Africa are witnessing what we're doing and saying, you guys are crazy, it's 2019. You are funding a newspaper that is now launching its second and its third title. But the numbers are there. You know, this is still an audience which, or the newspaper's audience, you know, aren't very digital, don't have great connectivity, and they want to pick up a newspaper and read it as well. And so, with the changing dynamics in South Africa, with the burgeoning black middle class, yes, I don't think these newspapers are going to be around forever, but at least for the next few years, this is a great business opportunity if done well.
In those minority languages, Deepa, anything to add?
Yeah, I think for us, when we support English language content, we're very careful that it has a clear influence strategy. We are looking very carefully at non-English language content across several markets, particularly India and Myanmar, where I think non-English language content is the mass market for the most part. I think, you know, given that, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Bilal said,
cool.
basically. So
We have time for one more question if anybody has one.
Yeah.
Otherwise, my last question to the team here is, how do people get in touch with you? How can they pitch you their idea? Bilal, go ahead.
So the easiest would be on Twitter. It's at BILALR. But you can also visit the MDIF website, which is very easy, mdif.org. And as I said, you know, even though something may not be ready for MDIF, I'm very excited to know, especially whatever's happening in Africa and the Middle East. And if you're in Latin America or Asia, Southeast Asia, I would happily put you in touch with my counterparts in those areas as well.
Cool, Sam.
I'm going to be at the International Journalism Festival in April, so come talk to me there.
Yeah, or see him at the Brufani tonight. He'll be holding court.
That too.
Deepa?
Yeah, my email's on our website. I check Twitter infrequently, so I'm unfortunately not
Cool,
the best
nice.
on Twitter.
No, that's great. Thank you guys very much. We couldn't do this event without you. Appreciate it. If you want to talk to these guys afterwards, let's move out so they can move on to the next session.